we're not here living our lives because we're that much harder working or smarter than anyone else in the world. That's not the case whatsoever, myself included.
Making music matter. Welcome back to Wednesdays with Wilfred. This week we have the incredible Darcy Ataman, the Faculty of Arts alumnus who has made transformational changes in major conflict countries. Thank you so much for joining us today, Darcy. How does a Faculty of Arts grad end up going all around the globe, sharing his message of music and healing for those who are going through some of the most difficult situations with sexual violence and other monstrosities?
Two stages basically ended up happening. The first was before I even started, this humanitarian work. I was living in Philadelphia. On one side where I was working was a gentleman who was a collector, and it was mostly sort of rock music being recorded there, and he had this incredible equipment. We had stuff from Led Zeppelin and the Beatles and Prince, and this was, I got to work on this daily. It was just phenomenal. And across the hall was Jazzy Jeff's production company. And during that period, if you're a decent music producer, you basically live in a chair in a studio for about 16 hours a day. You're not really part of the outside world. You're just what we call the cave. And what ended up happening was I would take breaks to just surf the net a little bit, just to clear your mind, back when you had to dial it up and the one office computer had it. I discovered for the first time outside news sources. So BBC News and Al Jazeera. And I started in 2006 reading about the AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa. And I was just floored by it. It wasn't in the daily news here in Winnipeg. And, stats about which blow COVID away, about 6,000 people dying a day, needlessly, and all this awful tragedy. And I kind of got obsessed with the injustice gap of it all. And I just kept reading and reading and reading, and started to do these one-off projects with the intention of, okay, I'm taking a year off my life. That was hard. I did my part in the world. I'm going back to the studio where life was a lot. And it just never ended up happening. The more time you spend in the field, and I've done well over 30 trips, long-term trips to Africa and other conflict zones around the world. The second sort of major piece was when I started doing these projects, there was a period where I got really down on myself because I just thought, this is ridiculous. Like, am I doing this for my own ego? If I'm building a school somewhere or a scholarship program, shouldn't I just fundraise for people that do a better job of this already? And while I was in that mode, I was in Rwanda for 5 weeks, filming a documentary and recording an album. Two major things happened within a couple of days period. Was one, I found myself unceremoniously in a secret prison in Rwanda, where one of the ways they sort of cleaned up the streets post-genocide was to throw any orphans or street children just in jail. Like, they would just throw them in a converted warehouse secretly in an industrial area of the city, because other countries like China were coming in offering to rebuild roads and things like that, and it looks really bad to have beggars on the street. I mean, that sounds awful, but that's really the mentality, which did not go very well for them or me, quite frankly, at the time. But listening to these young kids having their lives cut short in front of me, to put it bluntly, and then a couple of days later, I was in a schoolroom in the rural countryside of Rwanda recording kids that had written songs for us. And we just decided to give kids a fun day of recording. And it was such a contrast because all these kids were about the same age. And here they were singing really defiantly and joyfully all the stuff they had written for us. And it was really interesting, was because we didn't give them direction on what to write about, but what they gave back was all very, very heavy subject matter, mostly about the AIDS pandemic at the time and their rights not to sell their bodies to live another day, and their desire to go to school and things like that. Not one frivolous song in the whole bunch. Nothing about my desire to go to the club and dance. And we realized that music was a safe medium to talk about taboo subject matter.
Me, myself, coming from a conflict country, Sierra Leone, I remember growing up and music was such a big component in our household. Like you said, it's a way of therapy. And how did the Healing in Harmony program get developed after you went down to Rwanda and all these other conflict areas?
First, it took many years just to develop the model and program itself. That was at least a good 3 years. And it's important to note that when you're working with vulnerable populations, that there's an adage of do no harm. Just because we think we're coming in with a great idea that could help, if you don't think it through, you might cause more damage 1-2 years down the line. So it took us a long time to do all the proper testing and baselines and piloting and iterating the model and saying that worked, that didn't, and changing it until we got to something viable that's now codified in all these textbooks we have written. But it wasn't until 2015 where we got our first sort of major grant from the UK government that allowed us to operate at Panzi Hospital in Bukavu in the Democratic Republic of Congo with Dr. Mukwege. And it was that moment when we were able to do the program properly, so to speak, for the first time, where we start to see major results, and then others started to take notice, and we began to scale globally as we are now.
As you've impacted so many people in over 8 countries and now most recently Canada, what continues to drive you and keep you motivated? I can only imagine the toll of hardship and the empathy that you go through with these artists. And I love the fact that you call them artists instead of survivors or victims or different things like that, giving them a label that really signifies overcoming.
We use the term artist. And I think that's very important because it's the lens how I see the world. Like, no matter what, I'm a artist first and foremost myself. I think artists play a great role in society and in culture. And so that is a way of rebuilding somebody's self-worth and self-esteem, especially if you're in an active conflict zone and, you've had everything taken away from you. You have, no means, you could be physically traumatized, mentally traumatized, and you don't see a way out and you feel you have no power. But we try to rebuild someone's self-worth by saying, no, that's not true. You're an artist. This is why it's important to society and the world. You do have power. And we sort of reframe the definition of it. And it's really helpful that way. The second is what keeps us all going. And I don't want to sound trite about this. I mean this very sincerely because I spent 12 years in the field in these places. It is truly the resiliency of the people. Of course, there is bad periods, and sadly, I have a telephone book full of experiences that no one really should have. But I get all these little victories, of quantifying how much we've healed somebody and their trauma, or hearing the stories. I think that's about a year ago at one of our newer sites in Uganda, and the ladies passed a message on to me and they were all planning to commit mass suicide because they were ex-sex slaves of the Lord's Resistance Army that still operates in the area. So they thought, what's the point? They had no hope in life anymore until they came into the program and said, and once they graduated, they had dealt with the trauma, they gained their agency back, and they wanted to tell me that they no longer want to kill themselves. It's difficult to throw around language like that because it's just an honor to serve. But it's really things like that keeps you going. It truly is.
You're bringing the program to Canada, and I know more often or not, it's very easy to portray developing countries as the ones that are conflict zones. But even here at home with some of our minority and racialized population, there's some hardships and conflicts that are occurring right at home. Can you talk about a little bit what it means for you to have this program back in Canada and what you hope to see come from it?
First of all, it's something we wanted to do for many years. And, quite frankly, every time I would give a public talk, a speech, a lecture, and there'd be a question and answer period, it's usually the first question I got every time was, why aren't you doing this here? And it wasn't that we didn't want to, but we're not a standalone sort of program and model. We don't come into someone's home and say, this is how you should live, so to speak. So we need to be invited by the community. And that trust takes a long time to build. And the only way you can do that usually is by being there. That's the only way you get through the hardships as well, because you can have funding, get into a community, do your model and program. And if you get into a hard time where funding gets paused or whatever the case is, that program goes away, and you've done nothing but seed more mistrust in the community. By doing it sort of the right way and the hard way, by spending years there, building the trust that they know you're there for the right reasons, it gets you through those hard times because the community takes ownership. So to answer your question, I'm sorry, that took a long time here. That took longer than in overseas in the other, say, African countries in the Middle East where we work. So it was at times a little frustrating where we would get, we were getting large funding from the UK government, the Dutch government, and Canada, nothing, nothing. Even when we're partner with the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and still nothing. So it took extra time. And we're just really lucky with Fox Lake Cree Nation. They welcomed us into their community, but we took all those same steps. I went there a few times and just got to know the lay of the land, talked to the people, didn't force anything upon them. Then at one point we brought the studio equipment and did a pilot test with the community and the elders. And we had no hyperbole, a major psychological breakthrough within 10 minutes. And then, they were sold. The other piece to that is once you get all that, we like to insert into a larger holistic care model. So we don't come in saying, man, this is great. We got the funding. We're awesome. We're going to heal your trauma. But what if that community has no skills training or no economic opportunity? What's the point? You're setting them up for failure. So all those pieces had to be in place before we could operate. So that's why it honestly takes us a little longer to operate in a new area, because we have to check all these boxes and not all of them we're in control of.
I love the fact that you talk about that holistic approach, because more often than not, when you put the Band-Aid, you actually risk leaving them worse than you found them.
The other piece is just self-education. At least one good thing of the internet is that information is prevalent, and start to learn that the world is wider than what you can see, and that there's an interconnectedness. We're not here living our lives because we're that much harder working or smarter than anyone else in the world. That's not the case whatsoever, myself included. It's just simply born at the right place, right time. That's it, right? So we live in an area where our effort creates a result. Most of the world doesn't live like that. So just to get that understanding, I think is huge. And then the other part to realize, again, all your actions reverberate to some extent. For example, with the conflict mineral trade, I think maybe most people know that all the chips on our cell phones and TVs and gaming consoles and all that, have minerals and materials that are usually mined under duress. I'm just as guilty. I have an iPhone, and I know the supply chain is getting better, but I was in Congo in February, and I passed the mining district where I saw kids no older than 8 years old, enslaved, breaking rocks in a mine, instead of playing or going to school. And the results of that work are in my phone. And again, that's not to be high and mighty. That's just to understand that there's a connection to all of this. Mm-hmm. And it's going to serve us, because on the other flip side of that, they see that connection. Even if you're impoverished or in a conflict zone, everyone has a pay-as-you-go cell phone now. And because of that, they see the whole equation of the world, and they understand, oh, I'm enslaved in a mine, so you can have your 75-inch TV for cheap at Walmart. It's just to educate yourself and to understand there is that interconnectedness to the world. And we're very lucky to live in a place where our efforts create a result.
Thank you so much, Darcy. And, We are so honored to have you as a alumnus. On behalf of the University of Manitoba Alumni Relations, thank you for joining us, and I hope to speak to you soon.
My pleasure. Anytime. Thank you.